Surprise. So usually this episode drops an hour later, and what I'm doing this time around is we did a special stream on Monday for Afghanistan. There was we get into these heated conversations when we have I like to call them production meetings, because it makes me feel like we're not just a bunch of hens cackling. But Pascal, Jean, Bajlan, Kuberiznesky, and I often have, meetings about who we're going to book, who we can book, who might be a good guest, what's a good topic. And Jean helps out a lot because working in academia, he knows a lot of people. Also, he went to school in Oxford. So some of the people that he went to school with, some of the people that he's worked with over the years, he'll have like, there's a Turkish scholar that's got a real good outlook on Turkey and what's going on right now. Maybe we should have him on, et cetera, et cetera. So we were going not back and forth about Afghanistan. We're just having a conversation. We have a four-way call, and Pascal's like, we should do an emergency show. And Jean's like, yeah, we should do we did an emergency, like a last-minute show. So we put something together last minute, and I wasn't going to be a part of it. I was like, look, you guys do it. I feel very comfortable not being there. And actually, while they were doing it, I was doing this. I was dropping another audio-only podcast. It takes about an hour or so to get all this stuff done, these audio-onlys. And we had decided beforehand we weren't going to do any bonus patron stuff. We're just going to do it. And we weren't going to do it for the patron half. We're going to do it. And it's actually, a show is doing well. So I said, I'm going to drop it as an audio only, because if we did it for about an hour, I'm going to do it an hour before I do the usual audio only drop. And bam, there you have it. So as I am explaining this to you guys, it is 12:15 a.m. on Thursday, August 19th, and God damn it, I just turned 44. And if you've been listening to this show, I've been mentioning, kind of in passing, because I didn't know how serious I wanted to take it, that I'm dropping the last thing that we recorded as a band. And it wasn't kind of all together. Mostly it was me in a room. When the lockdown happened, I started recording all these songs, and I said, hey, we should put these together with some of these songs we did in Brazil. We actually recorded an EP that we released only in Brazil, and we wanted to sell it only physically. We didn't put the songs up online. So this is like the first time a lot of these songs have been online in 2 years. So I'm pretty excited about it. I just got done uploading it. For some reason, I'm nervous. I don't know why. I've been doing this for years, but this EP, I'm a little nervous. The artwork is amazing. Our good friend Michael Cobra, who actually does all of the artwork for This Is Revolution as well. He actually was the person that changed the theme of the show. The show was originally called Sound Waves because I lived in a studio called Soundwave. And the show was a little more music-centered. I still think there's a heavy musical element to the show with the clips and the fact that even doing this, I do this over music that I create. That intro is music that I created. But yeah, if you have a chance, I will actually put the link in the description. So wherever you're listening to this show, there's a link in the description to the Bandcamp, the Bitter Lake Bandcamp, so you can pick up the new Bitter Lake EP Coronavirus Sessions. And that Bandcamp address is bitterlakeoakland.bandcamp.com. And bam, it'll come right up. So I'm excited for that. Nervous and excited and excited and nervous. But this episode was a great deep dive into Afghanistan, and the one thing that I enjoy about the people that I do this show with is that they understand the need I have for context. This show is the original design of this show, the original idea of this show was for people that are new or thinking about coming to the left or interested in left politics. You need some sort of context. So Jean Bajlan does like a 15-minute history of Afghanistan. Pascal does a deep dive into Islam history. Kuba gives you more of the, as they were joking in the chat and on the show, the State Department side of things. But it was a phenomenal show. For the little bit that I did see, I did go back and watch a little bit more. I'm going to sit down and watch it again, but that is my cue. So I'm going to get out of the way. Thank you guys very much. Please enjoy this special bonus edition. If you haven't done it, share this show with your friends. YouTube.com/This is Revolution Podcast. I'm out. Peace.
Good evening. I am Pascal Robert. I'm your co-host for This is Revolution podcast. Tonight, I will be hosting a special episode that we decided to have with our foreign policy crew to discuss the current events in Afghanistan. Our main host, Jason, will not be with us tonight because he's taking care of some special production details that he has in store for us for some upcoming episodes. So Jason is fine. We're just working on some projects. So we decided to give him the night off. And I've got the foreign policy crew with us. So, without further ado, I'm going to announce our co-hosts for the evening. Most of you all who are familiar with the show know who they are. Those of you who are new observers of our show will see them regularly. We do usually have a foreign policy Thursdays with our foreign policy crew. And in the beginning of the fall, we'll start having a foreign policy Wednesday once a month with them as well. So without further ado, let me introduce my good friend and comrade, Jean Bajlan, who is, for those who don't know, a Middle Eastern history and politics and policy expert, graduate of Oxford University and professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Missouri State University. All very familiar with the area and the region, and he will be with us today. What's going on, my man, Gene?
Hey, it's good to be with you here tonight, Pascal. I'm looking forward to having this discussion. I think it's a really important discussion to have. I am also producing tonight for the first time, so excuse me, chat, if I'm making any mistakes, but I'm going to try and do my best this evening. But yeah, I think there's some important things happening tonight, and I think we really need to talk about them because they tell us a lot about American empire, what kind of things are going on. Afghanistan, of course, is, in the center of our sort of is in the sort of center of the discussion at the moment. But I think what's going on in Afghanistan really has broader implications for empire and questions like about how American empire operates and the costs that American empire has to many people around the world.
Excellent. Do we have our next co-host coming on available? Should I introduce him?
He is not here yet, but he will be with us as soon as he can. I've just sent him the link again, so hopefully he will be able to get on.
So, Gene, since we have you here and you are more a specialist in Middle Eastern affairs, and I have traveled and lived in the Middle East and the Muslim world for periods of time, so I have a mild, somewhat marginal familiarity with the area and its history in comparison to an expert like yourself. For the sake of our audience, can you give us a kind of grand historical comprehensive on Afghani history, Afghanistan in a ancient context or relatively pre 20th century context, and bring us up to today so we understand exactly what is the nature of the region we're talking about and what exactly are the issues and concerns that bring us to this point.
Yeah, so, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, but I do have a kind of peripheral sort of understanding of it because, of course, Afghanistan, it's a borderland country. It's between South Asia, it's between the Middle East, it's between Central Asia. So, within the sort of general world of area studies scholarship, it often falls through the cracks because it is very much a borderland region. It is a diverse country. There are numerous different ethnic groups living in Afghanistan. So when we talk about Afghanis or Afghanistanis, we're talking about a collection of different tribes and ethnic groups that have their own linguistic speciality, linguistic characteristics, religious characteristics, and historical characteristics. So the main group that people have probably heard of are the Pashtuns, but there are also Tajiks. And just for your listeners here, you might have heard of the country of Tajikistan. Tajik is actually, historically was kind of a synonym for Persian. One of the main centers of Persian language culture is the region of Khorasan. Khorasan today is the province in northeastern Iran next to Afghanistan. Yeah, it's the province in northeastern Iran. There's a lot of cultural connections with the Tajik or Persian-speaking region of Afghanistan. Historically, those places are very close together, along with the former Soviet Republic of Tajikistan. In fact, it's an extremely important center of Persian culture. It's actually where my wife is from. She's from Mashhad, which is an important city in Khorasan. And in fact, for many years, Afghans would call their homeland Khorasan, whereas outsiders would call it Afghanistan. So during the early modern period, Afghanistan was a borderland region between two big Muslim empires. You've probably heard about the Mughal Empire that ruled India, and the Safavid Empire, which ruled Iran. And Afghanistan was this border region that was contested between the two powers. But of course, Afghans and the people of Afghanistan, predominantly tribal people, also influenced these relations. The Mughal dynasty, Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, launched his invasion of the Indian subcontinent through Afghanistan. An Afghan dynasty in the 18th century briefly conquered Iran. So it was a borderland region, but it was also a region with, a people that was well known for its martial traditions. Now, fast forward to the 19th century, the geopolitical dynamics in the region change. We move away from this rivalry between the Mughals and the Safavids in Iran to a rivalry between Russia and Great Britain. Russia were advancing from the north into Central Asia, into Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, these Central Asian countries. This is Imperial Russia, of course. And then Great Britain was advancing in the Indian subcontinent. And so Afghanistan became a zone of conflict between the two powers as both powers sought to influence Afghanistan and the formation of the Afghan state. Britain launched several wars in Afghanistan during the 19th century. They imposed a protectorate on Afghanistan, took over its foreign policy, and Afghans, of course, resisted this. And, Russians would try to incite revolts. The British, and eventually even in the First World War, the Germans attempted to enlist the support of the Afghanistan. And this period is known as the period of the Great Game, the great geopolitical conflict. Now, in the 1920s, a new regime came to power. Amrullah Khan, who was a monarch, but very much taking a lead from the type of modernization projects that were going on in Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's Turkey and Reza Shah Pahlavi's Iran, trying to bring Afghanistan into the 20th century. His reforms ultimately led to civil war. He was deposed. He abdicated. A new Shah came to power. There were again attempts to modernize the country. The Afghans basically attempted to play off the Americans against the Soviets for aid and support. And I think I'm correct in saying during Afghanistan was one of the during the period of the monarchy, Afghanistan was one of the biggest recipients of Soviet aid. Now in '73. There was a kind of nationalist revolution against the monarchy. There was a one-party state was set up, and that regime lasted until the late 1970s, where you have a left-wing coup led by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, as you might know from all leftist parties, was a pretty fractious political organization. There were two main factions. The Parcham faction, Parcham means flag. They were the kind of more moderate wing. They wanted to sort of work at a slower pace to modernize Afghanistan. And then was the Khalq, the people faction, led by Nur Muhammad Taraki, who were the kind of hardcore Marxist-Leninists. Basically, as soon as the People's Democratic Party came to power, there was a big factional fight. Parcham were removed, and then Nur Muhammad Taraki was assassinated by his closest political ally, Hafzullah Amin. And there was this, huge crackdown. The country was kind of spiraling into chaos because of the kind of progressive reforms that the People's Democratic Party was attempting to impose on Afghanistan. This led to obviously reaction amongst tribal groups, and of course you see Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States becoming involved. The Soviets move in, they depose Hafzullah, and they put in power the Parchamist faction, and you have Abrah Kamral, who becomes the leader of Afghanistan. And then I think in 86 or 87, Dr. Najibullah becomes the leader of Afghanistan, and he rules until 1992. The Soviets pull out in 89, but they continue to support the regime until 92. And then basically in 92, the last remnants of the Soviet regime collapsed. The Mujahideen take the capital city of Kabul. But then the country, of course, continues in civil war, and we see a factional conflict between the various groups that had fought against the socialist nationalist regime during the 1980s. And one of those groups, of course, is the Taliban. And of course, in 1996, as people might remember, the Taliban basically capture Afghanistan. They murder Dr. Najibullah, and there's a kind of stalemate as the Taliban sort of consolidate power. There are still some pockets of resistance. People might remember the Northern Alliance. They maintained a stronghold in the north of the country, and there were other areas of resistance to Taliban rule. But of course, fast forward to 9/11. Eventually, the Northern Alliance become the foot soldiers of the American military operation to oust the Taliban. So that's kind of 500 years of Afghan history in, I don't know, two or 3 minutes.
You might have actually topped my 200 years of Haitian history in 20 minutes with that rendition. I'm very impressed. Good job, Gene. Let us bring in our next co-host, not guest because he's kind of part of our foreign policy crew, Dr. Crüe Wilczynski. I did not pronounce his name right, but that's about as good as it's going to get for me anyway. Dr. Crüe is a former Defense Department consultant who was a specialist in foreign policy and development studies. He is defected from working for the deep state for various reasons and now consults us in our foreign policy analysis on the various ways in which American empire tries to manage its foreign policy adventures in the globe from an insider's perspective. So why don't the crew and the audience welcome Dr. Crüe Wilczynski.
Gentlemen, excellent job, Gene. That was a sprint through some of the most challenging historical terrain that's out there, and you got us to the finish line.
Yeah, I was doing my best to try and summarize what is a very complicated and complex history and a fascinating history of a people, who are worthy of our respect and care. I think there's a lot of
I think that for anybody who's wondering how I came to defect from the deep state, obviously it was the money. Jason and Pascal were able to put together a package I would be a fool to turn down. You should see the size of my villa in Dubai. So, almighty dollar, right? Bringing people to the left like it always has.
We're rolling in it over here at This is Revolution.
Exactly. Got to pick up that bag. Got to pick up that bag with both hands. But the one thing that I'd add is when it comes to Afghanistan, there's a mental model that people have about what a country looks like. Central government that can administer the entire territory, that has legitimate authority from border to border, and a people that have at least some kind of shared national identity that, despite political differences or religious differences, they can fall back on. And Afghanistan historically has not had those things. The country is divided up into dozens of different cultural and ethnic groups. There's a religious divide between the Hazara, who are Shia, and the rest of the country, the rest of the other groups that tend to be Sunni. And in fact, there's also a minority pre-Islamic holdout area that is sometimes known by other Afghans as Kafiristan. And as a result, when people talk about the Afghans, it's a little misleading because which ones, right? And the interests of different groups can be extraordinarily divergent. And one reason why foreign powers that have attempted to intervene in Afghanistan have had such trouble with it is that domestic Afghan politics is often a zero-sum game. By winning the loyalty of one group, you alienate another group. And the different elements within Afghanistan will leverage foreign assistance against domestic rivals. And that happened in the case of the Soviets, and that happened in the case of the Americans as well.
Excellent, excellent, Kuba. I know you're going to give us copious amounts of analysis. So, for the purposes of the conversation, let's do a little bit of a backtrack into entering where I think is kind of a very crucial kind of crux in terms of where the U.S. steps in here.
Mm-hmm.
So the Soviet Union basically is, which was now Russia, but at the time it was the United Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, invades Afghanistan as a result of this conflict between these two factions that Gene has spoken of, sometime in the mid to late 70s. Is that correct, Gene?
Yeah, in late 1970, I think December 1970. My date might be a little bit up, but I think it's December 1970. Basically, in response to this factional struggle within the Khalq faction, and they basically ended up getting rid of that Khalq faction and moving in. So they were basically the Soviets did not like where things were going with the internal politics in Afghanistan, because there was a huge factional fight within the Khalq faction, between the Parcham faction and the Khalq faction, and also with Maoists, right? Don't forget the Maoists. So you were having this bloodletting taking place in Afghanistan, and the Soviets basically felt that we need to move in here to protect our interests. And it's important to remember, from the Soviet perspective, this was not a distant country. This was this was their near.
It was a neighbor.
It was a neighbor, and it was the Soviet Union, and they had 5 predominantly Muslim republics, which had ethnic connections inside Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan in particular. So there were very important strategic interests for the Soviet Union to ensure that. And the Soviets were not the only ones with an interest in Afghanistan as well. We also have to factor in India and Pakistan. India was generally favorable towards the left-wing government. If you remember, India is a kind of non-aligned country, leaning a bit socialist. And Pakistan was very much pro-American. And the last thing Pakistan needed after the military disasters of the previous few decades against India is to lose strategic depth in Afghanistan. The nightmare of the Pakistanis is to be faced on two sides by a hostile Afghanistan and India, of course, their main strategic rival. So
knowing that India and Pakistan are perpetual enemies, one against the other, and have been since pretty much the creation of Pakistan.
Yes.
And the invasion itself happened in 1979. There was Soviet influence before that, but the 79 was when military forces came in. And I think the role of Pakistan is crucial in all this, because like the Soviet Union, Pakistan has very close connections, cross-border connections with the Pashtun minority, which is the largest. It's the plurality within Pakistan in terms of ethno-cultural groups. And the Taliban is drawn heavily from the Pashtun south, with the Pakistani ISI, their military intelligence branch, seeing the Taliban or other Islamic, ideologically Islamic, Pashtun-based groups being useful proxies in fighting against India, especially in Kashmir. One tactic that the Pakistanis have used to great effect is leveraging their connections with groups that have credible deniability. These aren't Pakistani units, these aren't Pakistani commandos, but using those groups to conduct operations within Kashmir against Indian targets. That way, Pakistan can officially deny any involvement, but they have hardcore cadres that are quite willing to go in and do very dirty work against Indian targets.
Okay, so let us proceed then. The Soviet Union is now occupying the nation state of Afghanistan. Explain to us who were the Mujahideen opposition, who were supporting the Mujahideen, who financed, bankrolled, and facilitated the Mujahideen, and what exactly was their function at the time of this Soviet occupation?
Maybe I should take this because the answer is basically the deep state. After defeat in Vietnam, the United States sought to find a way to even the score with a Soviet reversal. And Afghanistan offered an opportunity to do that. The Afghan population was heavily divided, with a significant portion, especially in the countryside, of people who were used to fighting. They had fought foreign invaders, and they had also fought domestically, clan against clan, tribe against tribe, group against group. In the Pashtun South especially, there hadn't been a real rule of law society established, and instead tribal vengeance codes were the way that order was maintained. So you had people that were ready and comfortable with fighting, that were deeply religious, and an atheistic foreign conqueror coming in to try to aggressively, violently transform their society in the direction of atheism, communism. So there was a ready supply of Afghans, predominantly in the South, that were excluded from the government, that were hostile to the ideological transformation of their country, and who were willing to take up arms. The Afghan resistance, they declared a jihad against the Soviet forces and called upon Muslims around the world to support them. There was a great deal of sympathy for the Mujahideen. Mujahideen literally means those who do jihad in Arabic.
Absolutely, yes.
And there was a great deal of sympathy all across the Muslim world. And the oil shocks of the 1970s had meant that Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia in particular, had great resources available to spend on arming and supplying fighters, as well as many young men who were drawn to the idealistic, romantic notion of fighting holy war against the Soviets, who weren't an evil empire just in the American imagination, but in conservative Muslim circles, they were also seen as atheistic, totalitarian monsters. So the Pakistani government, trying for reasons of realpolitik and to deepen its strategic control, its hold over its northern territories, together with the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, and the United States, seeking to deliver a decisive defeat to its superpower adversary, established a logistical network that would ferry weapons and fighters from all over the Muslim world, especially the Middle East, especially Pakistan, into southern Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union. The United States was willing to deliver advanced weaponry, including most famously the Stinger missiles that were used to take down Soviet attack helicopters, as well as all kinds of small and medium arms. The volunteers, including a few Americans, made their way to Afghanistan to take up arms against the Soviets. And the foreign fighters that came in, on the Afghan side, there were many reasons to fight that didn't necessarily foreground religion. There were domestic political considerations. There was being frozen out of the government. There was personal or tribal rivalries. And there was the possibility of taking control yourself. But there was also a large pool of religiously motivated mujahideen, especially among the foreign fighters. Most famously, Osama bin Laden arrived in Afghanistan with money and with weapons to help support the Afghan fight against the Soviet-backed government. And the operations against the Soviet forces were quite successful. And in many ways, they mirrored exactly what we've seen with the United States in the last year or so. The countryside gets flips first. The Mujahideen have superior entry into Afghan society. They understand the language, they blend in, they know people personally, and they can use those networks to establish connections, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through persuasion, all across the country in areas where you don't have a significant presence of foreign troops. You flip the countryside where, and Afghanistan is still a very poor, very rural country, so there's a substantial population there. Then you use that to put pressure on the supply lines. You cut off roads, you cut off connections between cities and between the border and military bases. That way you complicate logistics, and the enemy ends up with just these ink stains, just these dots that need to be resupplied by air around cities like Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, Kabul. Then you chip away, and you can demoralize the enemy through attacks against soft targets. You demonstrate that your power and influence is greater to the civilian population. You undercut the willingness of local Afghans to support the incumbent government. And eventually, the authority that stems out of Kabul falls apart. There's no one left who'll listen to them, and the country is yours. Now, what happened in the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal was that the government had had longer legs than in the case of the United States. But after Kabul finally fell to a coalition of Mujahideen groups, that coalition fell apart, and a lengthy civil war began with Mujahideen commanders turned warlords fighting each other over the spoils, control of the international poppy trade, most of all, but also just being able to shake down population centers and having large populations that you could tax and brutalize.
Well, let's.
I just want to add one more thing here, Pascal. I think an important context to this whole Mujahideen conflict with the Soviet Union is also we have to connect it to the broader what historians call the Arab Cold War, right? So during the 1950s and 1960s, you had a series of revolutions or coups d'etats, depending on your perspective, across the Middle East. Nasser, of course, is the most famous in Egypt, but you have Abdul Karim Qasim in Iraq. You have Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And this leads to a division within the Arab world, with a number of regimes leaning towards the Soviet Union, depending on the Soviet Union for aid, which means the United States moves in to back a lot of these conservative, religious, reactionary regimes like Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia emerges as a major center of anti-communist, anti-socialist, and sort of anti-left nationalist action. We see this very early on with the British supporting the Saudi Arabians when Egypt intervenes into Yemen. There's a war in Yemen, and basically the Saudis are backing the conservative forces in that civil war. And we kind of get a wrong opinion about how Islamists looked at the West from the Iranian Revolution. Why do I say that? Well, Iran was a bastion of American influence in the Middle East. It was one of the most pro-American regimes that was out there. And it was there that the Islamists made their revolution. There was an Islamic revolution. And of course, because of the orientation of the Shah's regime, that revolution took a more anti-American than anti-Soviet sort of stance. They were still anti-Soviet. There were debates amongst the revolutionaries whether they should storm the Soviet embassy. And, during the Iran-Iraq War, in a remarkable piece of Cold War cooperation, both the Soviet Union and the United States leaned heavily towards Iraq. In fact, the Soviet Union was more in bed with the Iraqis during this war because, of course, again, the Soviets are concerned about an Islamist regime on their southern borders. But for much of the Sunni world, the primary enemy was not the United States, but rather the Soviet Union. And it's only in the 90s that, that all this sort of Islamist fire gets directed towards the United States.
Look at Rambo.
Yes.
One of the things we have to contextualize is that being that Saudi Arabia becomes the kind of titular head of the projection of Sunni Islam, which is the version of Islam that is practiced by the majority of the Muslim world, since about only 15% of the Muslim world is Shia. We have to understand that the antagonism towards the Soviet Union, in light of the fact that during the height of the Cold War, i.e. the 50s and 60s, many of these more radical Muslim leaders were looking towards the Soviet Union for aid and succor in their opposition to Western and European empire. That part of the projection, a large part of the Sunni projection on antagonism towards the Soviet Union is a direct consequence of the counter-revolutionary and reactionary nature of the petromonarchies and Saudi Arabia towards the notion of any type of liberatory exercise, whether we want to agree that it's a true or legitimate liberatory exercise or not, any type of liberatory exercise on the part of people within the Muslim world to maintain its sphere of influence. Because being what in Arabic they call Bayt al-Kaaba, the house of the Kaaba, which is the Mecca, which is the place, the holy sanctuary for the Muslim world, gives the Saudis, which in the Islamic world, and Gene will attest to this, have never been respected as scholars of Islam within the Muslim world. You ask anyone who's a scholar of Islam, ask them, well, what do you think of the Saudi sheikhs? It's like, since when do we start respecting the sheikhs from Saudi Arabia? In the Quran, there's the verse in the Quran, and Gene and I talked about this, where in the Quran, God tells the Muslims that the desert Arabs are the people who will know and understand this religion less than anyone else. And they will more likely be the hypocrites in understanding of that religion. Al-Arabu sharu kufran. Am I correct or incorrect, Gene?
Yeah, yes, there is a very complex relationship between the Bedouin Arab culture and urban Islam in particular in the Islamic world. And of course, the Saudis themselves, when the Saudi state was created in 1926, and I don't obviously want to divert too much on this, it overthrew the Hashemites, right? The base of the Hashemites, for those familiar with Islamic civilization, are a family that at least claimed descent from the Prophet's family directly. And also the Hashemites' base of power was in the Hijaz, which was a relatively developed region of the Arabian Peninsula.
Not integral to the Saudi core.
And let's
the
not
Saudis
forget
came from the center of the desert.
Najd.
They came from.
There's a famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad where he says that basically the worst of this ummah will come from Najd, which is the exact land where the Saudi royal family comes from. But the larger point we have to realize is that the Saudi royal family has been aligning with what Muslims conceived as the enemies of Islam or the West since the 1700s, with the rise of Muhammad Abdul Wahab and his unity with the British Empire. Okay.
And I think that this is a good place to take it back to Afghanistan. The Saudi royal family has, because of its close relationship with the United States, that was brokered over oil during World War II. It's always had this anxiety about not being perceived as Muslim enough because it cooperates with infidel superpowers. And among the shock troops that brought the House of Saud to power were the Ilkhan, the Brotherhood, which were jihadi, religiously motivated fighters. And the House of Saud has traditionally tried to shore up its Islamic bona fides by sponsoring what could be called, militant movements around the world, while at the same time continuing to cooperate with the United States opportunistically.
Financing terrorists, basically.
Yeah, I mean,
sure. Yeah.
When the Saudis came to power, they had to literally machine gun the more radical wing of their movement because they wanted to make a deal to be recognized as a state because, the radicals are like, let's go liberate the whole of the Islamic world.
And let's burn down Najaf too.
And in the 1970s and 1980s, the Saudis were facing huge internal problems with the radicalization of their own population because they subscribe to this very extremist Salafi Wahhabism.
And this brings us to the Taliban. So the Taliban are not actually the direct offshoot of any group of mujahideen from the anti-Soviet war. Rather, they are the boys that grew up in refugee camps along the Afghan-Pakistan border because millions of Afghans fled into Pakistan as a result of the fighting against the Soviets in the Civil War. And largely Saudi, but also other charities, other Islamic charities, established schools, madrasas, to teach the youth in the camps. Now, the Wahhabist faction, the Wahhabist tendency, captured that educational mission and converted those madrasas into indoctrination and training centers for an army, an entire generation of boys converted into a fighting force.
The word Taliban comes from the Arabic word talib, which is student.
Exactly. So it's the students. That's who the Taliban are. And when the Taliban enter Afghanistan in the 90s, they represent a break from the opportunistic, basically banditry and warlordism of the post-Mujahideen period, and promise to establish a stable system of order that was Islamically based, that had been handed them by the Wahhabis, or the Wahhabi teachers that the Saudis and other sponsors established in the refugee camps.
Slight disagreement with you here, Kuba, in terms of the lack of correlation between the Mujahideen and the Taliban. One thing that we have to realize is that many of the teachers in those schools that were buttressed and supported by the Saudis and the patron monarchies were soldiers that were Mujahideen.
Fair enough.
At the behest of the United States and the Saudis.
Yeah,
actually were the teachers of the talibs, of the students that became the Taliban.
Fair enough. My distinction was more that the commanders, the warlords, the actual leaders of the factions within that took on the Soviets, they weren't in charge of the Taliban. But yeah, a lot of the foreign fighters who came to Afghanistan to do jihad against the Soviets stayed to become the teachers of the Taliban.
So there's an organic connection, to put it this way, there is an organic connection between the Saudi regime, the United States, Pakistani intelligence, all these groups provide the material,
the incubate,
ideological basis, the ideological superstructure, as Pascal says, for the formation of the Taliban, which is what we might call a mutation or a metastasization of the Mujahideen movement that had emerged in the fight against the Soviet Union. And the Taliban, were extremely hardline Islamists, but they were also pragmatists at a certain level as well. A lot of this hardline Islam, the burqas and things like that, these were things they imposed in the city, right? In the countryside, they were a little bit softer handed because, in the countryside, women can't go work in the countryside if they're wearing a burqa or things like that. So
also the urban population was much more suspect ideologically.
But they were more cosmopolitan, urbane, modern,
Precisely.
and they were viewed as people who would be more likely to be fasiqeen, or people who would deviate from the religion.
More likely to be communists, more likely
And the Soviet regime, the pro-Soviet regime, and these groups like the People's Democratic Party, they did have a base of support in the sort of paltry intellectual urban classes, the nascent proletariat, educated women and things like this. I think one of the differences between the pro-Soviet regime, however weak its social base was, it had some kind of indigenous social base upon which it built. At the end of the day, the Soviets had been involved in Afghanistan for years, but this was the coup or the revolution that brought them to power was an indigenous revolutionary movement that was largely an urban phenomena. When we look fast forward to more recent events, the regime that the Americans established has virtually no social base. It had no meat. I mean, of course, the pro-Soviet regime still had to survive on Soviet aid even after Soviets left, but there was some indigenous basis to that regime, whereas the Americans.
There's also a political economy element here, which is that Afghanistan is breathtakingly poor, and it does not have domestic industry. It does not have a significant manufacturing base of its own. It's subsistence agriculture, opium, and that's basically it. So when you have a modern conflict that needs modern weaponry to fight, those resources have to come from outside. During the Soviet invasion, the Soviets supplied their side, of course, and the Saudis and the Americans supplied the other side. For the last 20 years, as long as the United States has been there, the area has been awash with American weapons, but also American money, foreign money. The type of income that you can make if you're plugged into the sort of contractor, aid recipient government sector is orders of magnitude greater than what you can make in actually working in the sort of Afghan domestic economy. And that wealth, that tsunami of cash pouring in, completely disoriented everyone. Like the opportunities that were available if you could find a connection to the outside world were unimaginable compared to if you were trying to live as an Afghan villager. So that, and the preoccupation of the foreigners was the war. It was fighting the Taliban, and that political economic force then reinforces the violence rather than tamping it down. The big business in Afghanistan was fighting. So many groups opportunistically participated in it in order to access the foreign funds, not just American funds either, but Pakistan. The Gulf continued to pour in money to Pashtun groups and the Taliban even after the Americans intervened against it. So that economic fact, especially compared to the brutal survival realities for Afghans living in strictly domestic conditions, also warped the development of the country in this much more violent direction.
So what becomes fascinating in this is that the Soviet Union, which is forced to extricate itself because of the victorious fight of the Mujahideen, they still have their kind of proxy regime in power after they leave, and that regime stays there for a few years before it's forced to evacuate and be consumed by the Taliban. The United States...
by the Mujahideen.
Mujahideen, excuse me, because the Taliban has not fully evolved. The United States, after a 20-year occupation, pulls out voluntarily, and within less than 2 months, the Taliban completely overtake.
We haven't even hit the deadline. I mean, the United States wasn't supposed to fully withdraw until September 11th, and Kabul has already fallen.
Yeah, it's a remarkable, but entirely predictable. I mean, the speed when it would have happened, you know, people can disagree. I think a lot of people were surprised that it happened so quickly. But you know, you look back at the Afghan papers. You look at the writing on the wall, you know, this has been predicted for a long time. And this was predicted when the United States came in and engaged in nation building. And it's not just a left-wing critique. Elements of the security services on the far right are also have been, you know, saying that this would be happening for years. Because as Kuba says, the American nation building project, what you're going to see is a lot of people are going to say, and Biden said this in his speech, oh, it's the Afghans' fault. The Afghans didn't fight. They didn't do it for their regime. And, you know, of course, for what happened, yes, you know, you can say that the Afghan the corrupt Afghan political class is to blame. But, you know, on the hierarchy of blame, you know, they're lower down than when we look at what the United States did, the ideological infrastructure which framed what the Americans did, and the utter delusional behavior of the United States and the dishonest behavior of the political elite in what they were telling people about this war. This is an utter indictment of any lingering notion that liberal internationalism has any meaning.
This is an interesting point. Well, let's not forget that the pretext that the United States uses for the invasion of Afghanistan is September 11th and the alleged complicity of Osama bin Laden in the September 11th attacks. What is fascinating, though, is that when the United States under George W. Bush demanded that the Taliban or the leadership of the Taliban, who was supposedly giving succor and support to bin Laden, when they requested bin Laden be turned over, the first thing that they stated was that we will be willing to do so if we can find an objective Islamic court system. We both negotiate to try him, but all you have to do for us to hand him over is to give us the evidence you have that he is the master behind this September 11th attack, and we will gladly, after a tribunal, give him over to you. And the United States completely ignored that request and went in and attacked.
I mean, the United States can't be trusted to try Julian Assange. Why would you believe that they'd be scrupulous about offering the most hated man in America a fair trial after September 11th? And also, it's an affront to the hubris of empire that a group like the Taliban, who wasn't even a recognized national government at the time, could make these kinds of conditions for fulfilling what the United States presented as an ultimatum. You know, you don't negotiate with an ultimatum. You obey it. And
yet the Reagan administration was actually negotiating with the leaders of the Taliban during the 80s in terms of trying to further coalesce them around, putting the kibosh on the Soviets.
Well, secretly, the U.S. government negotiated with leaders of Iran during to try to get its hostages out. It turns out that it's a luxury, but the leadership of the United States really likes to make a show of its unilateral power when it can.
So we got a super chat. We have a few super chats. Let's read them. All right, this is from Warren from Toronto. Shout out to Warren from Toronto. We know Biden is not good on foreign policy. See Cuba, the country Cuba, not Cuba, our guest. But based on the low standards of presidents, where does he rank since JFK? That's a very fascinating question.
Well, come on, we've got some terrible foreign policy presidents out there. We've got like Trump wasn't great, Obama was terrible,
Bush the father, Bush the son. Bush the son was worse than Bush the father.
Yeah, Bush the father at least understood statecraft.
Yeah, Bush the father was not as bad as some people would actually want.
No, actually, I mean, ideologically, obviously, I'm not aligned with him, but he was competent, which is more than can be said for a lot of the alternatives.
I think we need to give Biden time before we can make a pronouncement on Biden.
I would say that I'll be very honest with you. I mean, everyone knows my feeling. I think that Obama was one of the worst foreign policy presidents that we've ever had in this country.
He was. I mean, he had the Iran nuclear deal plus, but he also had Libya down.
But also, I would disagree with. I disagree on that, but only because the rest of the field is
the rest
really
of the
terrible.
It's really terrible.
That's true.
Reagan.
But Obama did cause the greatest refugee crisis in modern history by his Syria policy, Libya policy, Middle Eastern policy as well.
I think. The Syria policy. I mean, Syria is an outcome of Iraq, so it all comes down to. It's a big. They're all terrible.
Yeah, I'd put George W. at the bottom.
I would agree. W was worse than Obama, but Obama was pretty damn bad.
Well, let's give Biden some time to make a mess. Here's another super chat.
Okay, this is from Bryce Adams. Shout out to Bryce. Do you think that the U.S. is using the Afghan withdrawal as an opportunity for the rest of the world to see whether China is replacing it as the new quote-unquote global superpower and political influencer? This is a really good question, and it's something that we need to get into in our last 5 minutes. Will China step in and fill the vacuum that the United States has left, particularly since China has rather amicable relationships with Pakistan? I'd like to hear from first Gene and Cuba.
Well, I mean, I don't think the United States is using this withdrawal of Afghanistan in this way against China. I think there are elements of the American foreign policy establishment who are like, why are we in Afghanistan? Why are we wasting this money? The big issue is China. We need to do containment of China, blah, blah, blah. So Afghanistan is seen as a distraction and a waste of resources. Remember, a lot of the disagreement in Washington, D.C. is not on imperialism per se, but rather on imperial strategies. So I think that's an important thing that we need to understand about that. But I think China is going to be a key player because, Pakistan is pretty happy about the Taliban. I think the Central Asian republics will probably be like, at least there'll be some order. But China and Iran, both countries that have an adversarial relationship with the United States, also have reason to be concerned about the Taliban. Iran had no good relations with the Taliban. In fact, Iran nearly went to war with the Taliban in the late 1990s. There were huge waves of refugees, and I guarantee you one of the outcomes of this American withdrawal is going to be another big refugee wave, and I think it's going to be in a year maybe, because people are going to cross Iran. Iran can't cope with this Afghan refugees. They already have a big Afghan refugee problem. It's going to go to Turkey. Turkey is already dealing with Afghan refugees, and then we might see boats again. Who knows?
Turkey has 1 million Syrians.
That's more than 1 million Syrians. So I don't. And China. I mean, the baller move for China would be make a deal with the Taliban and drive a railway through Afghanistan. But the Chinese have their own war on terror and securities.
No, in China, it's really more a war on Muslims.
So they have their own inverted commas a war on terror paradigm, which they worry about as well. So the thing is, like, what we're seeing with this withdrawal, and I don't know if Pascal and Kuba would be agreeing on this, but at least for the cameras, the Taliban seem to be showing a remarkable amount of restraint. And that's because I don't think the Taliban want to end up in the type of diplomatic isolation that they ended up in the 1990s. So I could foresee them turning to China, but I could equally foresee them turning to the United States.
So to pick up on what Gene was saying, the Taliban have an unusual advantage because this is their second bite at the apple, and they've learned from their previous administration of Afghanistan. The fact that they were internationally isolated, and at that time they embraced it. They didn't mind that the rest of the world, especially the non-Muslim world, kept them at an arm's length. It's kind of a we welcome their hatred moment. But this time they understand what the consequences of that kind of isolation are. It means that somebody like the United States can invade you, and that's that. Nobody else will stand up for you. And they want to avoid that. They want to establish some regular diplomatic connections with outside powers, especially regional powers, and use a policy of mutual kind of non-intervention, non-interference as the basis of at least giving them some breathing room to stabilize and consolidate power. I don't think that the United States is using the withdrawal in any way. I think that is giving the American security apparatus way too much credit. This is a blunder. They don't know what they're doing, and this is where a series of bad decisions have led them to. It's not part of a master plan, and they are so reactive at this point that they can't even pivot and try to turn this disaster to some kind of strategic advantage. The United States foreign policy apparatus is really bad at strategy, actually. If you think about it, if they were any good at strategy, we wouldn't be in this global situation that we are in now. They have great power, but actually very poor vision. So I think that China's main preoccupation with Afghanistan is to prevent it from becoming a platform for Uyghur separatism or for any kind of ideological opposition to the communist government in Beijing. If the Taliban is willing to play ball on that, then they can talk. China has incredible resources in developing infrastructure. They punched a railroad through Tibet in some of the most difficult geographic conditions in the world. They could do the same in Afghanistan, but there's a real danger to that process, which is if the Taliban does not consolidate power, if there are still tribal groups or opposition forces that can exercise violence independently without being under the Taliban control, if a bunch of Chinese engineers and workers come in to build a railroad, there's going to be friction with the local population. Somebody's going to get killed, and then China will have a dilemma, a diplomatic dilemma. I think it'll want to avoid that.
I think you're being more hostile to the possibility of China's relationship with the Muslim world, and I would be no one. China, for its allegedly being so quote unquote anti-Muslim, is having a great time negotiating relationships with Iran right now, as well as with Pakistan. Not only that, I mean, yes, we understand that there are allegations of China's involvement with the Uyghurs. Some seem more exaggerated than others. I mean, I understand that those are the allegations, but still at the same time, none of this has stopped the realpolitik of the Chinese being able to engage effectively with Islamic nation states who see the Chinese as a better option than the West.
However, the number one priority for the Communist Party of China, which trumps any other consideration, is domestic stability and the consolidation of their authority. That comes before anything else. The CCP sees splitism, threats to the territorial integrity of the People's Republic of China as the greatest potential source of disorder. And the most likely sources of splitism are Taiwan, Hong Kong, and ethnic separatism, especially Tibet and Xinjiang. That's where the anxiety about their Muslim minority comes from. Because if there's a sustained assault on Chinese territorial integrity, especially on the ideological notion that the People's Republic of China is gathering the country back together and holding the line, then that's existential ideological threat to the authority of the Chinese Communist Party. So the fact that Afghanistan is a neighbor, the fact that there are some cultural and national ties as well as religious ties between Afghanistan and the Muslim populations within China, that complicates significantly, that transforms the relationship that China has with Afghanistan compared to China and Pakistan, China and Iran, China and anywhere else. The neighborhood is more important than diplomatic relations.
Gene, we lost your audio.
I would also add to that, China is very careful and cautious in its engagements. For example, in Iran, they're willing to do these trade deals. The Iranians, or at least factions within the Iranian regime, want to have a stronger military relationship with China, and the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to have to do that. The Chinese are not, they have their key areas where they are willing to project their military power, but they're not as indiscriminate. They do not want to get bogged down in a bunch of nonsense that they're not that interested in. They don't want to get bogged down in Afghanistan. They don't want it to affect them. They don't, there is a whole load of issues that the Chinese are far more cautious in their relations. And they also realize, they're not stupid, whether or not you believe the stories coming out about the Uyghur population, whether you believe it's all a fabrication of the State Department, whether you believe that everything that's being told is true, this has an impact on the perceptions of people in the Muslim world towards China. A lot of these regimes have friendly relationships with China, but they are dealing with their own populations. Turkey, for example, is being challenged from the political right over these issues. In Iran, Ahmadinejad, who is no tool of American imperialism, is very skeptical of Chinese influence in the country. So there's a whole lot of factors, and the Chinese are cautious, far more cautious than the United States.
Yeah, I mean, cool. We have to push back. This statement is that China is at war with the Muslim world. It's kind of
no, that's not what I said.
They're not at war with. No one is saying that they're at war with the Muslim world, but they have their own security concerns, which are entirely
the domestic situation in the CCP is a different world entirely than their international policy. China is not at war with the Muslim world. However, it sees the Chinese Communist Party sees any locus, any nexus of organization and authority outside of its own control, outside of the supervision and oversight of the party, as being fundamentally secessionist, fundamentally seditious. So that Falun Gong, they're not Muslims. They're nothing. You can't be more Chinese than Falun Gong. They practice Tai Chi. But because it is a nexus of authority outside of the Communist Party, does not answer to the Communist Party, it experiences severe repression. The attitude towards Muslim groups, if you are willing to subordinate yourself to the Communist Party of China, then you're fine. It doesn't matter. You can be Catholic. You can be a bishop in the Roman Catholic Church. You can be an imam. It doesn't matter. But if you are claiming any kind of independence from communist authority, that is when the repression strikes very severely. And they see ethnic groups, especially ones that have strong connections based on things other than Communist Party ideology or Han civilization, they treat those with extreme suspicion.
And I would add to this that this is not irrational. Within living memory, China disintegrated as a unitary state. From the 19th century until the communists take over, China was enormously fragmented, especially after the 1911 revolution. So there is an enormous amount of sensitivity about the potential influence of outside forces on separatism within China. Nobody here is saying that, I'm seeing some of the chat here and they're like saying, "Oh, you're being like anti-Chinese." This is not This is not saying that other countries are pro-Muslim or that China is at war with the Muslim world. This is just outlining some of the strategic concerns that China might have in dealing with the Taliban. And I think there is a 50-50 chance that China could strike a good deal with the Taliban. They have proven capable. Turkey was initially extremely on board with the whole Uyghur thing. Erdogan went to China, they chilled it all out, and they turned it.
Let's take these two super chats. How do we combat they had 20 years narrative that we see from even some progressives that erases U.S. culpability in what's happening there?
Okay, I've got a very simple example for this. You're going to get a lot of arguments saying that, well, if we'd done this differently, if we'd done that differently, if we'd made this different choice, we could have made it work. And I'm going to tell you why that argument is ridiculous, right? You can do counterfactuals all day long. Some counterfactuals are more plausible than other counterfactuals. But let me give you a counterfactual. The notion that the United States, given the United States ideological and bureaucratic structure, could have made a better job in Afghanistan. The parallel I would draw is, it would be like someone saying, well, the Confederate States of America, they had the best generals. They could have won the war if they'd had more manpower. If they just mobilized Black people into the military in 1860, they could have won the American Civil War. Now, that might be on paper like a truism, but at the same time, it would completely ignore what the entire ideological superstructure of the Confederate States and why they were fighting the war in the first place. So to conceive of the fact that given the nature of the American foreign policy bureaucracy and military industrial complex, that they could have done anything different is to misunderstand the problem. They had 20 years. There were people who were happy for this to go on for another 20 years because they were making money. But eventually the factions were maybe we shouldn't be wasting this money while we go, instead of focusing on aggressively combating China, who they see as the bigger threat. That faction won out.
And also, who's they, right? The United States never established institutions of authority within Afghanistan. First Karzai was their guy, then they didn't like Karzai.
Yep.
They would, rather than backing any kind of domestic authority, they would fall back on their own ideological superstructure and its delusions, right? We need a multi-party democracy. We need inclusiveness. And they would unravel the ability of Afghan leaders to actually be able to implement any stabilization strategy of their own. And the United States has done this time and time again after the Cold War. In Iraq, it was the same thing. You had Shia parties that were happy that Saddam was gone, that were willing to work with the United States. But if you're going to work with them, you have to actually let them govern the country. But no, every time somebody looks like they're going to consolidate power in a way that would allow them to emerge as a national leader, the United States says, no, this needs to be inclusive. We need to get everybody together. And then they undermine the moves that are being made by Afghan leaders or Iraqi leaders to try to bring some kind of stability and some kind of order to the country, all for the sake of sounding good in the New York Times. Someone brought up the fact that Falun Gong supports one of the most anti-Chinese propaganda mechanisms in the Epoch Times, which is true as well.
Yeah.
When you say it's anti-PRC, don't conflate the People's Republic of China with all Chineseness, right? The Falun Gong they've got personal reasons not to like the PRC.
I get that. Well, listen, we're at the end of the hour. We've actually gone over the hour. I'd like to thank our chat participants and our audience for coming in for this special Monday night. This is Revolution.
It was a big show.
Night. What did you say, Gene?
We have 259 people watching. So hi there, chat.
Please subscribe to our YouTube page. Hit the bell. Become a patron. Check out our website for merchandise. Also, tomorrow we'll be having a conversation on the Black Church. What is the revolutionary potential of the Black Church? We'll have Reverend Dr. Nicole Alexander Floyd out of Rutgers University. I look very forward to that conversation. Thursday, We will have Milton Alamati, our Africa specialist, talking about what's going on in South Africa, and we'll maybe broach some of the topics on the African continent overall. And so check us Thursday at 9 p.m. Jason will be back on Tuesday, and we will Thursday. Jason will be going on vacation towards the later end of August. So for about 2 weeks, it'll be me, Gene, and a few other guests who will be holding down the fort. I hope you all were satisfied with my ability to be the primary host this evening and moderate the various positions on this very, very complicated, nuanced geopolitical reality. And we hopefully look forward to seeing you tomorrow night and Thursday and continually in the future. And we are out.